Good day and welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton at Radford University in Radford, Virginia, serving as guest co-host this week. And joining me is noted humanities scholar and all about fabulous guy, Clay Jenkinson. Hey, Clay, how are you?
I aspire to be fabulous. I'm great. I'm in Chicago, just taking a little tiny professional break from my third phase of the Travels of Charlie national tour. Just an interesting fun fact, I just had a wonderful hour-long conversation with one of my favorite people, Professor Edward Watts of UC San Diego. He's a classicist, and we were talking about whether Rome has anything to teach us as we descend into American paralysis. And at the end of the conversation, I mentioned Steinbeck, and he said, I don't know how much you know about Steinbeck, but didn't he write that great book, Travels of Charlie? And I said, Ed, I'm living it. And so it was just a great moment because he loves the book. I'm sending him some gifts now, but also I said, go to the website. It's like Steinbeck on steroids.
Utopia. Absolutely. Well, you know, it's funny to talk about that and to talk about some of the challenges of great nations, great states of the past. One of the challenges I think we face nowadays is the rise of the ease of sharing information. It's both good and bad. You just mentioned being able to share your trip and being able to use social media and the website to be able to help folks understand what you're doing and your travel across America. It's wonderful to listen to Americans, but it is also a channel for the rise of conspiracy theories. They seem to be everywhere, and they've existed as long as people have been around. But I would say that in today's world, we seem to be awash in many, many conspiracy theories that are propped up on social media, that are propped up for political purposes, that are put out there to move the needle one way or another for any particular person's point of view. And today, if we might, I'd like to talk about sort of the history of conspiracy theories in America, some of the significant ones throughout our 250-year or so timeline, and then where we are today with them and the risk and danger of some of those conspiracy theories. What do you think?
Sounds fine. I'm going to give you a quick short list here, and then we can decide which ones we want to talk about. But of course, there are still those who believe that the moon landing was faked in a Hollywood studio. There is, of course, the conspiracy that COVID was generated on purpose by the Chinese government to destabilize the world, and particularly the American economy. Or how about Pizzagate, going back to 2016, when it was alleged and widely believed that key Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, were running a sex trafficking entity in the basement of something called Comic Ping Pong Pizza in Washington, D.C., in Greater Washington. One of the most consequential conspiracy theories in history, David, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This was a pseudo-serious manifesto by Jewish people. Again, this was a complete fake, 1905, saying that they were seeking world domination, and here's how they were going to undermine capitalism and infiltrate governments and so on. That was not only seriously embraced by the Nazis as one of the proofs, I'm using air quotes, that there was a Jewish international conspiracy, which, by the way, is one of the conspiracy theories that takes new forms in every generation. But I did not know this till I started to do a little bit of research. Henry Ford had 500,000 copies printed.
Wow.
The inventor of our automobile industry, or essentially the creator of the Model A and the Model T, was a serious anti-Semite, and he had printed at his own expense 500,000 copies of this pseudoscientific tract, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and distributed them around the country and around the world. That's appalling. But let me tell you what I think is the most appalling conspiracy theory of all. And that's Alex Jones, who is a perpetrator of many conspiracy theories, saying that the Sandy Hook school shooting was an inside job, that it was done by the CIA or by somebody to make it possible to lock up and confiscate guns in the United States. Now, he lost an extremely important civil court case where he was forced to shell out almost $500 million to the families of the children who were slaughtered. You know, we both know that he knows this is not true. Without any question, you and I both know that he knows that this is a crock.
Absolutely.
He perpetrates this. Hundreds of thousands and even millions of people either believe it or pretend to believe it. Imagine if you're the families and your children were cut down by some moron with a lethal weapon, and then out of the blue, for purposes purely cynical, somebody promulgates to millions of listeners that this was a deliberate attempt to kill children in order to undermine the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. You know, the Bible, in several New Testament Gospels, talks about the unforgivable sin. It's not ever defined exactly which one it is. I would say this is an unforgivable sin. And I'll tell you what's almost as bad as this. Even though the judgment has gone against him, even if he lost everything, which he won't, his followers will refill his coffers with loans or gifts of hundreds, thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars because they like what he does. That's how pathetic and even evil people are who are Second Amendment absolutists, who would be willing to damage actual grieving families for purely selfish, ahistorical purposes in this way. I don't really care if you believe that the Roswell landing was a UFO. I find that amusing. And if you go to Roswell, they've made a whole tourist entity out of it.
It's pretty harmless.
It's harmless. But Pizzagate is harmful because someone actually went there with an AR-15 and was going to shoot up the place. Luckily, he was stopped. But things like the Parkland shooting, which Marjorie Taylor Greene has said was an inside job. And by the way, she's one of America's most prominent conspiracy theorists.
Jewish space lasers.
Jewish space lasers for the forests of California, or her belief that the killing of more than 50 people in Las Vegas was a deliberate attempt to lock up America's guns. Now we're moving into evil, real evil. But the Sandy Hook one is the one that bothers me most.
I can't disagree with you. I think one of the challenges is that many of these theories are put out there because they can make money. They gain traction. They also can help people deal with issues that are inconvenient and uncomfortable and say, well, this must be something different. It must be a government conspiracy. It must be something hidden, because they can't accept the true facts that are very uncomfortable and that require effort and change and activity and things along those lines. I think all of these are worthy of discussion. Could we go back, though, almost to the founding of our nation and talk about the one theory that has kind of been a thread through the many, many decades, and that's the Illuminati, that there is a controlling secret government out there. That pops up in many ways throughout some of these other theories, that the Illuminati are really behind everything and has found its way into our money and into our federal buildings and documents and things along that line. So that might be our starting point to begin and talk about how infectious these theories are in American life.
The Illuminati are somewhat separate from the Freemasons, but they're often collapsed as a single sort of entity. Freemasonry has had a very significant place in American culture, but not anything like what is alleged about it. And so if you take out a dollar bill, you'll see Rosicrucian iconography, Freemason iconography, the pyramid with the eye, and so on. These are parts of the Freemasonry movement, and many of the people of the Enlightenment were Freemasons. Jefferson wasn't a joiner. He didn't really want to participate in exclusive this or that. And so one of the questions I get all over the country from Masons, and my father-in-law was a 33-degree Mason. He was a Grand Master in Kansas. All the time people will come up and say, was Jefferson a Mason? Wanting me to be able to say, yes, he was. He was not. But because of this movement, which was tied in with the Enlightenment, it was deistic, therefore it wasn't Christian in the fullest sense of the term. It has secret rites and secret rituals and so on. My father-in-law would tell me about some of the things one had to memorize to this day, although in a very small way today. But over the course of time, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians have taken a lot of abuse because they're secret, I think, and because they're not fully on board with Christian Protestant American values, that they have been suspect. As you say, this is one that just won't go away.
And I think it provides a basis for people to make other claims and to consider things that way. Polls show that up to 50% of Americans believe in one or more conspiracy theories.
I do.
And well, what's the conspiracy theory you believe in?
And when we come back from the break, I want to talk about it. I was just on the 6th floor at Dealey Plaza last week, and I've always believed that there's more to this story than we know, and we can get into that. Conspiracy theories, most of them are crazy. Most of them are baseless. But there's an emerging psychology of why people believe in conspiracy theories. One is that they're idiots. Another is that they're evil, like Alex Jones or Marjorie Taylor Greene. Another one is that people can't stand the truth if the truth doesn't satisfy them in some way.
If it's inconvenient, if it's something that is unfortunate, that is challenging, that requires effort on their part, that requires some big change, that requires anything that would be uncomfortable. I think that's the crux of it right there, to be honest with you.
One more, my friend, and that is that government lies to us about important things. I don't know what happened at Roswell. The local newspapers had banner headlines. Something happened there. It probably wasn't the landing of an alien spacecraft, but the United States government covered it up. When government lies to us, as it does again and again and again, it lied about Roswell and covered it up. It probably was a secret military high atmosphere balloon of our own manufacture. The government didn't want to divulge this. But think of the conspiracies that our government has perpetrated about assassinations that it has done elsewhere in the world. When your government lies to you, and you know your government is lying to you, then this opens the door to disbelief in all sorts of things, and particularly that which your government declares. And so I understand why some of this happens. If government always told the truth, and by the way, government can't always tell the truth because of security reasons, but if government always told the truth, we wouldn't have as many conspiracy theories as we have. But we know that you cannot rely on your government to tell you the truth on some very important matters, and I think a natural Jeffersonian skepticism steps in at that point.
And on that note, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll make our way to Dallas, Texas, and look at the Kennedy assassination. Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. Hello and welcome back to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton, serving as guest host this week from Radford, Virginia, and I'm pleased to be talking with Mr. Jenkinson today about conspiracy theories. We're off to a rousing good conversation talking about the history and the rationale behind some of the conspiracy theories that are out there. But, you know, we've had recent events that have reminded us that every time something happens on a national level, that there can be questions that are unanswered or unanswerable, and that leads to more conspiracy theories. Case in point, July 2024, an assassin's bullet barely grazes or missed Donald Trump, depending on how you look at that particular situation. And that attempted assassination has spawned a number of conspiracy theories, which takes us in mind back to one of the more famous conspiracy theories, and of course, the sad assassination that was successful of President John F. Kennedy. Now, you recently had a journey that gave you more insight regarding that situation.
First, let me say something about what happened in Butler. President Trump is speaking in Butler, Pennsylvania at an outdoor rally. An assassin gets close with an AR-15 and shoots him in the ear, a few centimeters, and we would have had the assassination, the head exploding of an American president in high resolution. You know, we have low res with the famous Zapruder film. But of that assassination attempt, the simple truth is it should never have happened. Mm-hmm. Something went wrong. This should never, ever have happened. This is an obvious example of something that can't be explained unless there was either incompetence of the highest order, or worse. Well, I believe it was just incompetence in this case. But because of that, those who believe that President Trump has been unnecessarily vilified and that there's a deep state that wants to prevent him and so on, you've heard all this for the past 8 or 9 years, this opens the door to those conspiracy theorists that say, since this never should have happened, it must have happened on purpose. Fair enough. If our Secret Service had been up to speed, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We're lucky, and I've been haunted. I've awakened in the middle of the night over the past couple of months. I remember exactly where I was when this occurred. Mm-hmm. I've been awakened almost in a cold sweat thinking, what would have happened if the assassination had been successful? Would there have been civil war?
I was going to say, not the way Americans settle political differences.
No, and so I don't think that this was an anti-Trump assassin. It looks like he was sort of a opportunistic assassin, that he was right. Looking at Biden's travels too. He did what assassins do. He was looking for fame. We won't mention his name. But if Trump had been killed, we would be in the worst nightmare, I believe, politically since the Civil War. And it might have erupted into actual street fighting, because if conspiracy theorists think that the assassination attempt was a deep state event that failed, imagine where they would be if it was, in their mind, a deep state event which succeeded. So Thank goodness he missed. I was in Dallas the other day. I have been fascinated by the Kennedy assassination all my life. You're too young to remember. I do remember. I was in Western North Dakota that day, and we watched television for 3 days, nonstop, really. And it was the first time I ever saw my father cry. And it was an incredibly important inflection point in American history. I think you could say that nothing has ever been quite the same. So this loads it with importance. By the end of the day, J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI declared that it was a lone gunman. And the Warren Commission, which sat for many months and had very distinguished people on it, including Gerald Ford, concluded that it was a lone gunman. The American people never accepted the Warren Commission's report. There was doubt even then, and that was a much more trusting era than this one. But here's one immediate question. How could J. Edgar Hoover declare on the Friday of the event that it was a lone gunman? How could he possibly know this? I mean, I don't think he was part of a conspiracy, don't get me wrong. Or if he was, it was a conspiracy to create a simple, easy narrative that the American people might be willing to accept, rather than the possibility that it was a conspiracy involving the Soviet Union or the CIA or the mafia or Cuba, who knows. But to rush to that leads me to believe, among many other pieces of evidence, that we should not accept the Warren Commission's conclusion at face value. And you talked earlier about how conspiracy theories arise out of our unwillingness to accept certain truths. Jacqueline Kennedy, when she found out that it was a lone gunman, said, "What? He wasn't killed for his civil rights work?" I mean, she said, I'm quoting now, "some silly little communist did this." That was the quote, silly little communist. Some pathetic loner, some loser, some misfit with a rifle. I mean, the course of human history is adjusted by some little ant of a human being. She would have been happier if it had been a conspiracy, because then it would have had more significance. It wouldn't have been so randomly absurd, and so on. So we can talk about this. First of all, what's your view? And there's no penalty for being a lone gunman theorist.
My take on it is very hard to keep secrets to begin with. And the more time that goes by where true evidence, something that is reliable, doesn't leak out, it leads me to believe more often than not that what's there, you have to take at face value. And I think part of it is challenging because it seems so incredible. Like it couldn't possibly happen. Some guy climbs to the top of a book warehouse, puts a gun out the window, and shoots the leader of the free world. How is this possible? Although, ironically, what happened in the Trump situation? Some random person, no significant figure, climbs to the top of a building, has a line of sight, and is able to shoot at a president. How is that possible? And I think you're 100% correct when you say incompetence probably rules the day in these situations. Now, having said that, I don't know. I mean, there's certainly things that make you suspect and make you wonder. And unfortunately, the Zapruder film, as well as some other additional photographs and things taken, show a little puff of smoke on the grassy knoll or show unusual figures in other areas where it's easy to draw those conclusions. But for me, the most simple solution is often the one that makes the most sense, because the more complicated it is, the more you have to rely on so many levels of individuals keeping that secret, controlling that information for 60 years of time, and putting it in a way that doesn't reveal something that gives you the aha moment. So that, I think, informs my process a little bit based on what I know. The often the most likely thing is that thing that you couldn't be that. It's too simple. And I think that's part of it. And I think your quote about Mrs. Kennedy being shocked that it wasn't part of some grand communist plot or some civil rights related issue or the mafia or something else, because all of those things were possible. I think it becomes hard to believe that it couldn't be something that big, that it was something so simple and so insignificant.
Fair enough, my friend. I'm not going to argue with you here, of course, because we're really just trying to discuss the phenomenon and not trying to get to the truth.
Absolutely.
But it's a couple of things. One is, first of all, that the magic bullet theory, which was created by Arlen Specter, who was not on the Warren Commission, but he was an investigator for the Warren Commission. This is before he became a distinguished United States Senator from Pennsylvania. He created the magic bullet theory. Why? Because the timing suggests that there couldn't be too many bullets. So we know that one bullet missed entirely. We're sure of that. Hit the curb, knocked up a little piece of concrete into a bystander's eye. Now you've got one. You can at most have four and probably only three. So the second bullet goes through the throat of the President of the United States. We all know that. And the third was the kill shot. The magic bullet has to be magic because it has to do so much work. It's not the bullet that killed the president, it's the bullet that maimed him. And Arlen Specter was trying to figure out how to keep the timing for just that many bullets, because if you add more, then it has to be a second gunman. So he has to keep it limited, and he decides that bullet went through Kennedy and also into Governor Connolly in 3 or 4 different places. It hit bone, etc. That bullet was recovered. I'll come back to that. But that bullet is virtually pristine. And anyone who knows anything about ballistics knows it's unlikely that a bullet that did that much damage and touched bone and went through several people can be pristine. So he had to strain the evidence to make that work, because a fourth bullet almost certainly means a second gunman. And then, of course, we all know about the way the president's head exploded and whether that's a front shot or a rear shot, and the intense debate that's occurred forever about that. But recently, as you perhaps know, a Secret Service man who was there named Paul Landis wrote a book called The Final Witness, which I read instantly, in which he confesses that he tampered with the evidence. He found the magic bullet on the back of the seat where Mr. Kennedy was sitting. He put it in his pocket because he was afraid it would be lost or taken as a souvenir or something. So he put it in his pocket, thus tampering with the crime of the century. Later in Parkland, in the emergency room or the hallway, he realized what an amazing thing and a really incredibly irresponsible thing he had done. He claims he then put it on the gurney. If that's true, and there's some doubt about that. Clint Hill, who was also there, says no way. But if that's true, that shatters everything, because the magic bullet theory comes about from the finding of the bullet on the gurney and so on and so forth. My view is that the magic bullet went through the president's throat, where it didn't receive much forensic damage, and winds up on that seat. But be that as it may, if Landis is right, all bets are off. And why he waited until 2023 to admit this raises some very serious questions. He may be senile. He may be, who knows what he's doing. The argument that you make is the one that's made by most people, and that is secrets don't survive for 70 years, that by now somebody on his deathbed would have said, yeah, well, it was the CIA, or yeah, it was the mafia. The fact that this has never happened, coupled with the theory of Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is probably the true one,
Right.
leans towards Oswald as the lone gunman. We don't know. If you put me on the witness stand and said, I want you to declare definitively that it was a lone gunman, I would say, I can't do that. Equally, if you said, I want you to declare definitively that it was a conspiracy, I would say, I can't do that. It's a mystery, and goes back to our theme, my friend, where mystery exists, conspiracy enters. We don't know what happened that day, and we all feel a little bit like Mrs. Kennedy, like this little knucklehead. One more thing. As we all know, 2 days later, Oswald's being transferred from one jail to the next, and Jack Ruby kills him in cold blood in the police station. That sounds so much like a mob hit, that he was being silenced because it wasn't clear that he would keep silent and that he might divulge the truth about this thing. It's almost impossible to square what Ruby did with your theory that this is just a simple lone gunman. Ruby's own story, take it or leave it, is that he was so upset by all this, so certain he did not want Mrs. Kennedy to have to come back to Dallas later to testify, that he decided just to end it right there. That's possible, but remember, in one of the few statements that Oswald made in that jail, he said, hey, I'm a patsy. And I believe, personally, I believe that he was a patsy. We may never know. They just released a gazillion documents in the last 18 months, but they're still withholding a very large tranche of documents, and you have to wonder, how can it be in 2022, 2023, and 2024, when this is ancient history, that our government would still choose to sequester certain documents? Why? What can you think of a possible reason why our government would not want to divulge every piece of evidence that it has?
Honestly, yes. I imagine there were things happening that are probably still happening to this day that are in some of those documents that they probably don't want to share, much like the Roswell incident, a scientific weather balloon that they did not want to give away any particular technology or ability or a study that was taking place. I think that's the challenging part of this. There's probably reasons that some of that information is
Why?
still
Give me
redacted.
I mean, I'm not trying to doubt you, but give me a reason why the government, if this is not a weather balloon, if the government wasn't involved, if the Soviets weren't involved, what possible reason could the government have to hide anything?
There could very well be involvement, but not in the way we think of. There could very well be participation, but not as contrived as what we are led to believe, with either multiple gunmen or a vast conspiracy beyond that. It could be that through the course of investigation and other things, that things were discovered and linked together, but not in the way that people think it is. I think that's the challenge. I do think the government is involved in some things that we're unaware of that probably we would not approve of, and those things still take place today. And revealing some information could very well undermine activities in other places. But more often than not, I suspect that it's probably just erring on the side of caution, not releasing information with the idea that so-and-so is still alive and they participated, or they did something stupid, that they put a bullet in their pocket, or that they put a bullet on the gurney, or whatever may have occurred. You also have to remember these are people. And sometimes people are like, well, Joe's grandfather was my friend, and I'm not going to release this information, and I have the ability not to release it. I think that's part of the challenge, too, that there's not some grand plan or grand thought related to it, but it is related to relationships, or it's related to individuals and how complicated that is. But you brought up a really good point. Where there is mystery, there's doubt, there's conspiracy.
If I may, I believe that it was disaffected CIA operatives and Cuban liberation forces who felt betrayed by the botched Bay of Pigs landing and by Kennedy's refusal to go to nuclear war with the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. I believe that it wasn't the CIA, but it was CIA operatives and associates, and that this was the reason that he was killed. And I do believe that this will be resolved at some point. Now, let me just say to conclude, I could very, very, very easily be full of beans. I've read probably 50 books on this subject over time. This is one of my obsessions, and I don't really even know why. My point is, we just don't know. And just last point, because the government has not released all the papers, that generates more conspiracy theory. If they released everything, it might be bad. Maybe it says that somebody from the CIA had a conversation with somebody who once had a dinner with Oswald, and therefore that could be volatile. Is that worse than actually the conspiracy theories that arise from those papers being sealed to this day? I don't know. But you see how it works.
I don't disagree with any of that. And I think your fascination with it and America's fascination with it, the world's fascination with it is a part of it. One of the issues is no matter how much is ever released, someone will always say either there's something that's still missing, it was burned, it was destroyed, it was this or that, or they'll even take the documents and through their twisted interpretation or their omission of it, will use it to prove whatever point they want to prove. So it comes back to sort of the point where there's mystery, there's going to be conspiracy theories. When there's things we don't know, we're going to have these elements that pop up within our world and cause us to speculate and to wonder and to think of the fantastic and to tie threads together that may not exist. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, let's revisit one of the most famous events in human history and one of the most famous conspiracy theories, the moon landing. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson.
Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm with David Horton of Radford University in Radford, Virginia, my dear friend, an occasional host of the Jefferson Hour, and now Listening to America. We want you for more such programs, and I won't even bring up some of the promises you've made to me over the years that have not been kept, but I'm not, I don't hold a grudge. But I know you just said between segments that you have been the victim of some conspiracy theories where you live. We won't ask you about that, but it's everywhere. It everywhere. It's a form of political character assassination. People who know better promulgate these things. So I just want to ask, where were you on November 22nd, 1963? Because now I have some doubts about you.
It was 5 years before I was born. Now, as a time traveler,
That's your story, and you're sticking to it.
That's right. As a time traveler, I moved through all eras, but officially, it was 5 years before I was born.
Ted Cruz's father was part of the assassination.
I heard. That's what Donald Trump told us all, right?
And Ted Cruz forgave him. Donald Trump said that Ted Cruz's wife was ugly.
Right.
And he said that Ted Cruz's father was part of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And you would think that should probably do it. That should probably be the end of any association between these two. But no.
Politics makes for strange bedfellows.
Oh, my. So let's talk about another one. Were you alive in 1969?
Yes, I was. I was just 1 year old when the moon landing took place.
I was a good deal older than that. I remember it. We sat in our living room. I was a photographer for the Dickinson Press, and so I set up a tripod, and I had 2 rolls of Tri-X film, and my sister was like rolling her eyes and just wanted me dead. But then I would take photographs of the screen of there were no VCRs in those days. There was no digital recording. If you missed it, you missed it.
Right.
And so I took these photographs. I still have one of the first photographs I ever developed in my home darkroom of the screen that day. But this was one of the great days, not only in my lifetime and yours, but one of the great days in human history. And I think at some point, when history is written 4,000 years from now, the Kennedy assassination won't be part of that. But the day we landed and walked on the moon certainly will, because it was the first time humans have left the Earth, gone to another sphere, walked on it. And so it's probably the first baby steps of what will at some point be galactic travel.
Absolutely. And I think it is also one of the most observed events in human history because television was there. Walter Cronkite issuing the report and being amazed by what had happened. All of the networks carrying it, watching as much as we could watch live taking place. Like you said, you either saw it or you didn't. And I think that's interesting because that kind of goes against the point of, okay, where there's mystery and things we don't know, the conspiracy theory arises. There it happened in a way before our eyes, as much as it could be with the technology. But yet there are plenty of people who want to say, oh no, that's all a science fiction film directed by Stanley Kubrick or whatever the particular conspiracy theory may be. And they look for every single element to try to point out why it must have been faked by our government. What do you think? Did we land on the moon?
Of course. You know what the number one evidence that is put forward for the conspiracy is?
What?
The flag appears to be waving.
Waving. That's
and
right.
so that can't happen on the moon. So it must have been in a sound studio. But in fact, they had trouble getting the flag up. And we can talk about the whole problem of flags and sovereignty and claiming the moon and so on if you wish. But the flag was deliberately redesigned so that it would have a wave look, so that the rod that was holding it had sine curves in it so that it would look like it was furling. On the basis of such slender and obviously disproved evidence, this conspiracy theory arose. Part of it was the time that this happened. This is 1969. It's the year of Hamburger Hill, the Charles Manson murders. This is a rough moment in American history, and anyone who thinks that we're living through the roughest moment, except for the Civil War, should think about 1968 and 1969 when the country was coming apart in a way that it is not now. Cities were being burned by angry African Americans in the Black Power movement, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King in April of 1968, and then Robert Kennedy a couple of months later. The Vietnam War had gone into a really ugly phase, and everyone knew the war was lost, but of course we couldn't admit it. This was chaos time in America, and so for this to happen right then, when there was profound disillusionment, let's say, I would say that there was profound American disillusionment and a loss of confidence, then you have this spectacular technological moment. And I think people thought, no, that's just government faking it. This is all propaganda. I would say that, and I'd like your opinion on this, but I'd say that this one belongs to the school of moronic.
I don't disagree. I think there's money to be made, though. That's the key to a lot of these, that denying it, that creating this elaborate theory, that selling a book, that selling a movie, that having someone go on a lecture tour to explain exactly why these things are occurring or why it's a conspiracy. There's money to be made. And if you follow the dollars, you can understand why somebody would do it, and perhaps why somebody would believe it as well. So it is moronic, but I also think it's bigger than that. I think people see an opportunity. It's kind of like the flim flam man who brings the medicine show to town. If they can sell you the medicine and make the bucks, why not?
I don't take this very seriously. I don't think you do either. Who in some sense, who cares? If there's some huckster who wants to make $1 million by giving lectures around the country saying that it was a soundstage and he can prove it somehow, fair enough. It doesn't damage America, because I'd say that 99% of all Americans believe that the moon landing actually happened. And of course, subsequent moon landings also happened. And we have more high quality video from subsequent landings. It seems to me you have to really deliberately shut down your rational capacity to believe that the moon landing was faked.
I've actually met a man who landed on the moon. Edgar Mitchell spoke and was a friend of mine, and I had a long conversation with him. So I'm a little less than, a degree removed from the moon, so to speak, but I had the opportunity to talk to him about conspiracy theories. Now, it's interesting because he actually believed that there could be extraterrestrials and aliens, things we couldn't explain. So that's
he did ESP experiments from the orbit of the moon. I wouldn't say he's a loon. I did an online course on religion in the space program. I find him fascinating. I also was, and I won't go into details, but at the University of North Dakota, where I was teaching in the law school and staying in a faculty apartment complex, I went down to get my mail one day. I was 26 or 7 years old. And Buzz Aldrin was also a visiting professor there, although he never turned up. And he had a post office box. And I was there getting my mail, and a very, very fetching woman came up to me and said, "Are you Buzz Aldrin?" And I had to have.
Were you Buzz Aldrin that day?
I had to have a very severe internal dialogue at that moment, and I told her that I wasn't Buzz Aldrin, and she went away. So I have several connections to this, but you've met some of these people. You don't believe, no part of you can believe that this was fake.
Knowing what I know about the technology of the time, knowing what I know about government at the level I understand it, no, I don't think that that's the most logical outcome of the situation. I think the most logical is what we saw and what we have as the storyline. Now, are there elements of it that are exaggerated? Are there things that perhaps were not as smooth as we thought they were? Are there things that were very near misses? Absolutely. I think there's more to the story than we're ever going to know. But again, I kind of go back to this theory that if something that grand happened, there'd be many, many more clues to it than what we have, and things that would be much clearer, much closer strings, particularly as technology gets better and we're able to examine things through the lens of modern technology looking back through time. And particularly as we age out of some of those periods where almost everybody who was a part of it has passed on. Typically, you would have more of that coming out. There was just recently a movie that came out where the recording of the moon landing was a backup in case something went wrong, which was much more plausible to me than a faking of the moon landing where we weren't going to be able to do it or we couldn't do it, and that's what took place. Having said that, I do think that it's healthy sometimes to have this skepticism as long as it's within the right areas. This all comes back to one particular subject, critical thinking and analysis. And Americans in particular, but people all around the world, struggle with that muscle, struggle with the ability to evaluate information and to actually know where to impart data and where to impart opinion and thought and be able to come out of it with a perspective that is actually based in something. Some of this stuff is fascinating we want to believe other things. We want to believe that there's life out there. Or we want to believe that there's a bigger force. Even with a horrific situation, there's a bigger force. But more often than not with a conspiracy theory, I think it really is that something truly horrific happens and we can't possibly believe that's what it is. September 11th, 2001. I think is a perfect example of the unimaginable happening on American soil and theories coming out of that it could not have possibly been as simple as hijackers getting on a plane, running a plane into two towers and bringing the towers down, running a plane into the Pentagon, that a group of passengers could crash a plane in Pennsylvania. And all of this happening as an attack on America. There had to be something else. What are your thoughts on the September 11th attacks?
Well, first of all, where were you at that moment?
I was sitting at my desk at work, and I can tell you the horror I felt. Not really sure what was happening. Phone lines went down. Internet went down. I had a TV radio where I could listen to television broadcasts and radio broadcasts. That was one of the few things that still worked to be able to get information. And the scary part here in Virginia with the attack on the Pentagon being part of it, we wondered, are there other targets? Are there other places where things might happen? Your mind automatically goes to, this is the most horrific day I can recall in my life on a national scale, not a personal scale necessarily. And what's going to happen? Is this the beginning of the end? Is this the thing we've all feared where Armageddon is coming and the next terrorist attack is literally just around the corner?
Remember the first conspiracy theory moment in this story. It goes back to another conspiracy theory. The Jews in the towers were told to stay home that day. Remember that?
It was a holiday. That's right.
They were told, don't come to work today. And
Right.
that proves that it was an inside job and
Right.
who knows what. So that's how these things start. You go to the well of things that are always working.
And I think what complicates it even more The nature of the towers themselves, the way they were constructed, led to the specific way that they fell. And that is hard for people to believe because they don't understand that the towers in New York were made differently from almost every other skyscraper that existed up to that point. And that's what allowed them to be larger, to be more commercially viable and all that. But it also allowed for the airline fuel to create the kind of structural damage that would cause the towers to implode the way that they did, which gives rise. So it's one of those little strings of evidence that if you don't really understand it, you can use to prove or to advance a conspiracy theory.
I've seen a gazillion documentaries on this subject, and the insulation on those struts fell off when it should have held. It was also regarded by many as a paper fire because there was so much printed paper, printed material in the towers that once they ignite, that produced an even more horrific conflagration than might otherwise have been. People simply thought a plane couldn't bring down a tower.
Right.
Turns out it can, and now the new Freedom Tower has been designed in such a way that theoretically it could withstand such an impact. But, one of the conspiracy theories was that it was an inside job, that we did it ourselves because we wanted to go to war with the Arab world for their oil. And other versions of this, that all the versions tend to be inside job. And I can remember people telling me two things, and I'll bet you have stories to tell about this too. Someone told me with the greatest sincerity that they knew exactly where explosives were placed prior to the event in the building at key vulnerability spots, so that the planes were just a window dressing, I suppose you would say, as part of a cover-up. That was one of the conspiracy theories. The other one is much more frequently invoked, and that is that at the Pentagon, that was not an airplane. Whatever that was not an airplane.
I've heard the same things. Here in Radford, we're about 4.5 hours away from the Pentagon. There were people that I knew that worked there. And you heard theories that they had heard of the same thing, that something else must have occurred. And I had people tell me, no, I was there that day. It was an airplane. This is what occurred. This is what happened. I think that's the hard part, too. In things that are unbelievable, people have to come up with something that to them is more plausible and something that they can live with.
When we started thinking about this a few weeks ago, I've done some reading and research on this, and I'm fascinated by the psychology of this, but I wanted to see if there was any Jefferson connection whatsoever. Well, there was a rumor in 1800, I believe, that he had died, that circulated in northern newspapers and broadsides and so on. At that time, there was almost no way to prove that he was still alive. It didn't apparently affect the outcome of the election, and whether that's fully a conspiracy theory or just a rumor that sort of went viral, I don't know. But his daughter Martha, his beloved elder daughter Martha, wrote to him when she was a impressionable young woman, a teenager, and said she'd been hearing rumors of the end of the world, and what should she do about it? And Jefferson wrote a lovely letter to her saying, clear your head of this. This sort of thing always happens. The end of the world's been predicted a zillion times and it never comes about. This is a form of neurosis. You should make sure that you are more intellectually mature than that. If you need reassurance, we can have a conversation about this and so on. But that was another one of those things that circulates from time to time. Remember Y2K. Y2K was going to destroy the whole cyber world and collapse. I knew people in Reno who, they were banking on it. They were absolutely certain, and these were not idiots. They were certain that they were the only people who understood how to survive Y2K. Well, it came, it went. And so I think that this is human nature. We're not rational beings. We're fundamentally irrational, pretending to be rational. It's kind of groovy. It's kind of fun. Conspiracy theories are kind of fun. We've had some amusement in talking about this. And it is amusing if it's the moon landing, but it's not amusing if it's Pizzagate and that entity has to go out of business or people's lives are actually damaged by it. And so it's the ones that I want to combat are the evil ones who are doing this for the worst possible motives. And I think, I won't say they deserve to rot, but they deserve to be diselected.
Well, I think one of the answers for folks is just what we've done here today. Have a good discourse about it. Talk about it. Listen to it. think about it with people and understand why you believe what you believe, why you're hearing what you're hearing, and how you move forward from there. This has been a wonderful edition of this program, and I always thank you for your insight, my friend. I feel better every time we talk, and I want to thank you for all that you do as you listen to America.
Even though you see me as yet another Kennedy conspiracy theorist, you should read Paul Landis's book and decide for yourself what to make of it. I have some significant doubts about it. But just as to close, my friend, I'm fascinated by all of this. I truly want to believe that we're up to it, up to the challenge of life, up to the challenge of friendship, up to the challenge of living in a republic, up to the challenge of living in a dangerous world. You know, it turns out that may not be true. And that's so disappointing because, of course, that would not greatly upset John Adams because he knew humans are full of it, that humans are deeply flawed. But my man Jefferson believed that humans are capable of utopia under the right circumstances, and that if we educate ourselves, if we stay close to the land, if we renew our constitutions, his whole optimism is on deep, double secret probation at this moment. But Jefferson's optimism about human nature, I think, is on trial. If that's true, that there is an honest desire for a more autocratic, centralized, strongman kind of government to solve our problems, then Jefferson was full of it. Then it's a 100% repudiation of Jefferson's belief in the human capacity to do something remarkable with their lives. So, I hope not. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you, my friend. This has been Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson.
Thank you all.